The belief in rationality, empiricism, and perfectibility that I have sketched in the previous video also meant a belief in the possibility and even the necessity of argument, of dialogue, of communication, particularly critical communication in the sense of argumentative. As Pope put it, a man should never be ashamed to own he has been in the wrong, which is but saying, in other words, that he is wiser today than he was yesterday. So this idea that you communicate with someone, you find out that you've been wrong, and then you can improve and you can get better through that. And that is something that happens through dialogue, through critical dialogue and arguments. So preconceived authorities, social authorities, religious authority that are already there are gradually replaced by rationally argued authority. And the basic idea is what is right can be convincingly explained. This was the idea behind this. The universe is ordered, is a perfectly ordered cosmos. So if you don't understand it yet, you just haven't found the clue. So what is right can be convincingly explained, but that also means what cannot be rationally explained might just not be right, even though it has been held as true for centuries because authority has told you. And all of this applied to every rational human, which we have to say at the time still often enough excluded poor people and often excluded women completely. But in theory, it applied to every rational human being and not just those at the court who create their own system of communication. So more and more, the middle class wanted to participate in this debate and not just marvel at the cleverness of aristocrats as they had to do on the Restoration stage. So what was needed were places of public debate, or what Jürgen Habermas has come to term the public sphere. He calls it Öffentlichkeit in German. And it was just at that time that two such places of public debate developed, a real place and a metaphorical one, the coffee house and the journal. All right, so let's start with the coffee house. And of course, for this, I have to take a sip from my gigantic tea. Because tea was also drunk at the coffee houses. So to start with the coffee houses, the first coffee houses opened in what was then called the Orient, Turkey, Egypt, Persia in the 16th century. In the 17th century, they were introduced into Europe through Austria and then arrived in England. The first coffee house in England was set up in Oxford in 1652 by a Jewish man named Jacob at the Angel in the parish of St. Peter in the east in a building that is now known as the Grand Café. So 1652, the first coffee house opens. By 1675, so just a few years later, there were more than 3,000 coffee houses in England. By 1739, there were 551 coffee houses in London alone. So there is really this explosion of coffee houses, the institution that of course comes with the introduction of coffee and tea and also chocolate as beverages. And that gives a particular space. It also gives a particular kind of consumption because of course coffee and tea are a different drink than to what was usual because it became the first widely used non-alcoholic drink in Europe. Now, people at the time, they didn't drink water because the water that you got in the city wasn't healthy. You had to do something with it, boil it, brew it. You didn't drink milk because it was not possible to get enough milk to the people all the time. So they drank beer and wine. So it was common. The common drink was alcoholic. So this is the first time that people start drinking something that is not alcoholic, but instead something that makes you more alert, makes you more awake, makes you more concentrated. So in a way, Europe awakens from a half-drunken stupor to the wide-eyed existence of coffee, and that is the moment, of course, when you start debating rationally instead of just brawling in the tavern. So the association with restraint, the association with clear thinking that coffee brings it is an important aspect of how the coffee house became such a breeding ground for this type of public discussion and debate. So again, Alexander Pope describes the effect of coffee in these lines here. Coffee, which makes the politician wise and see through all things with his half-shut eyes. These places, of course, had a political significance right from the beginning. They were seen particularly by government as potentially suspicious. Charles II actually tried to suppress the London coffee houses as, quote, places where the disaffected met and spread scandalous reports concerning the conduct of His Majesty and his ministers. So basically what we're talking about is transparency, is people starting to talk about what the government does, what the ministers do, and that cannot be good if you want to keep power amongst yourselves. But the public loved them, and the literati loved them. For several decades following the Restoration, the wits gathered around John Dryden at Will's Coffee House, and Dryden would hold court there, and they would throw around their wit and so on. So that was they immediately became also part of the cultured life of the city. And the coffee houses were great social levelers. They were open to all men, and they were indifferent to social status. It was relatively cheap. You had basically paid your entrance, and then you had a coffee flat rate, so you could stay as long as you want. As you can see from the way that the tables are spread out, you basically just find a place to sit somewhere, and there is no social distinction in the spatial setup. Here's some more images of contemporary images of these coffee houses. So coffee houses were great levelers. They were open to all men, and as a result, they were associated with equality and with republicanism. In a way, we can compare them to what happened on the early modern stage, where also the different social classes came together. But here, in addition, people did not just watch; they could actually talk. So it's more interactive in that way. They were socially significant. Coffee houses became meeting places where business could be carried on, news could be exchanged. The insurance company Lloyd's of London had its origins in a coffee house run by Edward Lloyd, where the underwriters of ship insurance met to do business. So they're part of the developing economy as well. Coffee houses. So the coffee house was the concretization of a space, both literally and metaphorically, of public discourse. They would connect people to the influx of information, because the coffee houses usually subscribed to all the journals and all the newspapers. And back then paper was still prohibitively expensive. So everything that was printed on paper was expensive. Even the cheapest newspaper or journal would be expensive. So it was much more economical to pay the entrance for a coffee house and then be able to read all of the papers for as long as you want to. So it became an enabler of public discourse and debate, a communicative space where people could talk to each other. And as we can see, all of this is connected to another new formed institution, and that is the press. Already during the 17th century, there were many kinds of publication that told both news and rumors. Among these were pamphlets, posters, but also ballads and so on. In the beginning of the 17th century, the right to print was strictly controlled in England. That was probably the reason why the first newspaper in the English language was actually printed in Amsterdam in 1620. So in the 17th century, there is still a very tight control partly over news publishing, if you will. The Civil War, of course, escalated the demand for news. News pamphlets and news books reported the war, often supporting one side or the other. And then following the Restoration, there arose a number of publications, including the London Gazette, the first official journal of record, and the newspaper of the Crown. Publication was still controlled under the Licensing Act, So there was an act of parliament where you that granted a license only to one company, and that was an effective way of controlling the press. But then in 1695, the Licensing Act lapsed, and Congress failed to renew it. So from that moment on, there basically wasn't any way to control and to censor the press, and that of course brought with it an explosion, a further explosion of journalistic publications. Close to 900 papers were in the press during the first 6 decades of the 18th century, and the numbers even grew with the century. And there was sort of an exponential increase in these. By the accession of the third King George in 1760, 100 papers were issued every year in England. And the periodic production of the final year of the century were 10 times the number of those in the first year. So it's really a very, very steep increase. In the 1720s, there were 12 London newspapers and 24 provincial newspapers. So the newspapers were being read in the coffee houses, but they were also the inspiration for a new kind of journalism that based on the model of communication that the coffee houses brought about, and those were the so-called moral weeklies. The moral weeklies appeared regularly, but they were not newspapers, but rather had one essay per issue. They were basically just regularly published series of essays together with an advertisement. The most notable examples being the Tatler and the Spectator. The Tatler was the first. The original Tatler was founded in 1709 by Sir Richard Steele. You see him here on the right side, who used the nom de plume Isaac Bickerstaff, Esquire. And this is the first time that we have sort of this use of a persona, consistent persona through several essays to sort of half fictionalize the speaking person. So it wasn't Steele when he said I, but it was Bickerstaff. But behind Bickerstaff, of course, there is Steele. Now, Steele's idea was to publish the news and the gossip heard in London coffee houses, hence the title, the Tatler. Seemingly from the opening paragraph, the idea was also to leave the subject of politics to the newspaper. So this was basically everything that was not politics, but rather something that is concerned with correcting middle-class manners, with this idea of refinement, of progress. As he says himself, instructing these gentlemen, for the most part being persons of strong zeal and weak intellects, what to think. So these are essays that tell people what to think. It's kind of an exercise in right thinking. To assure complete coverage of local gossip, a reporter was placed in each of the city's popular coffee houses, or at least this was sort of the implication from some of the essays. This was written from this coffee house, this was written from that coffee house. So the idea was that by reading these, you can participate in the most interesting debates that were going on in these coffee houses. In its first incarnation, the Tatler was published 3 times a week, originally just from 1709 to 1711. So both of these early weeklies had very short runs, but then we have to remember that they were more or less written by one or just a couple of persons who had to write these essays 3 times a week. So that was, of course, a lot of writing to do, and at one point they would just be tired of this. Steele ends the run of the Tatler, but together with Joseph Addison, whom you see here on the left side, he starts another publication on the same principle, and that was called the Spectator. So this is how the Spectator would have looked like. These are sort of 2 sides of one sheet. So these moral weeklies were basically one sheet of paper that had these had one essay on them on the back and front. Spectator was a daily publication, so Steele and Addison had to write one of those essays every day, and it ran from 1711 to 1712. So again, just a very short run, but had a very high impact. Each paper or number was approximately 2,500 words long. The original run consists of 555 numbers, so 555 essays that were written by these, which were then later collected into collected editions. So despite their modest daily circulation of approximately 3,000 copies, so the original run was approximately 3,000 copies, the Spectator was widely read. Joseph Addison himself estimated that each number was read by 60,000 Londoners, particularly because the coffee houses had them and many people would read them and people would pass them on. And if that is true, then that would be a tenth of the capital's population at the time. So 10% of Londoners would have read each issue. The stated goal of the Spectator, you can see here, would have been, here are the 555 issues, and the stated goal was to enliven morality with wit and to temper wit with morality. So we see kind of the heritage of the Restoration, that wit, being witty, is of prime importance, but now this wit needs to be tempered with morality. You can't just say anything just because it's witty, and don't care for whether it is good or bad or morally corrupt or whatever. So you have to temper the wit with morality, and a stated goal to bring philosophy out of the closets and libraries, schools and colleges, to dwell in clubs and assemblies, at tea tables and coffee houses. So to bring this to a wider audience, to bring this to what Habermas called the public sphere. So the essay that is being developed here is modeled on this ideal of rational debate. There's the development of different speakers, which stand for different viewpoints, and that sort of tells us that it's more about the debate than the result, but it also is something that would lead to the fictionalization in the later novels. But it's also the ideal combination of education and entertainment. They're all out. I mean, I told you how Enlightenment literature is really there to improve us and to educate us, and these essays definitely are sort of one of the prime forms for this. But they do that in a very educational, in a very entertaining way. You can really read. You can still read these essays, and it's very interesting, and they're great to read. Obviously, you learn a lot about the 18th century, and you're made to think. And they're connected to the Enlightenment ideal of refinement, of manners, and of morals. Again, every topic was possible except for clear, sort of mainly news or politics. So as I said, they were read a lot in their original runs, but even more so in the collected editions. This is one of the reasons why I would single out this relatively short run of the Spectator and the Tatler, because they were bound in these volumes and they were bought and read and reread by many people during the rest of the 18th century. They basically became sort of a standard manual for conduct and for manners for the age. Basically, if a household had one book, that would have been the Bible. As I said, paper was very expensive. If they had two books, that would have been the Bible and a collected edition of the Spectator and the Tatler. And because you had so few books, you would read them again and again and again and again. So we can't overstate the importance that the Spectator and the Tatler had on the morals and the manners of the 18th century.